Once Upon a Crime, Chapter 8. Doing it without the dog this time. He's made his feelings quite clear. He's not a fan. So hopefully he won't try and come in the middle of it. Okay, Chapter 8. An hour later, Gretel's garden was host to a macabre little party. Herr Peterson, cold and pale, lay where he had fallen. Kapitan Strudel strode about importantly, giving orders and making notes. Several minor kingsmen took measurements of this and that. 2 disturbed the adder's nest, causing 10 minutes of panic and mayhem, and 1 impaled himself on a gargantuan bramble and had to be rescued and dabbed with iodine. Hans was standing, staring at the body through a protective cloud of cigar smoke, declaring himself repulsed by the sight, but unable to tear himself away. Gretel was sitting in her deck chair once again, a second, even more generous brandy clasped tightly in her hand, her nonchalant expression masking a certain nervousness. She was aware of the Capitan's antipathy toward her, and knew he would relish the opportunity to make trouble for her if at all possible. Having a fresh corpse in her garden, and the victim being not only someone she knew, but someone who connected her to another dead body in another place, was a gift for the Weasley little man. She was thankful at least that Hans had been out when Herr Peterson had seen fit to use his last breath to haul himself into their garden. She had taken the chance to consider the situation, weigh up her options, and act decisively and swiftly before raising the alarm. What she was now hoping was that no one would choose to play up her connection with the deceased, nor focus on the curious nature of his injuries. "What I don't understand," said Hans, swaying a little, as was his custom at this point in the evenings, "is why Herr Peterson should choose our back garden to die in. I mean to say, it's not as if we knew him at all well. We weren't friends or anything, just met on our way to the hotel where poor old Brackston came to such a messy end. There was a lot I didn't understand about that too, like why the local kingsman insisted that dreadful knife we found sticking out of him was Gretel's. Went on and on about that, he did, like he had some point to make." He drew a tobacco-filled breath. Gretel ground her teeth, not taking her eyes off Kapitan Strudel, who had turned to listen attentively to what was being said. "And what else I don't understand," Hans ploughed on, "is why poor Peterson here was so determined to see Gretel about something or other that he dragged himself through our sizable hedge to expire at her very feet, when there was absolutely no one else about." He puffed again. Gretel felt a muscle in her jaw begin to jump. Kapitan Strudel scribbled furiously in his notebook. "And I'll tell you something else I don't understand, is why, when the unfortunate fellow apparently died of poisoning, judging by the way his hands are still clutching his throat, his eyes are all bulgy and staring like that, and his skin is turning a revolting shade of eau de Nil, he appears to have lost 2 of his fingers." There was a noisy silence, filled with the sound of worrying conclusions being drawn and connections being made. Gretel swirled the ice in her glass, focusing intently on the melting cubes, struggling to maintain an inscrutable countenance. Strudel leaned closer to the body for a better look. Hans had not yet finished making a bad situation worse. "Looks to me," he said, "like those of fresh wounds, as if he'd only just lost the fingers when he came blundering in here, which makes you think they might be in the garden somewhere, doesn't it? I say, Gretel, doesn't it make you think that, eh?" Gretel was thinking many things at the moment, and all of them involved painful cruelties being inflicted upon her brother. "What? Oh, I don't know about that," she said, a smidge too casually. "Could be he lost them ages ago. Could be all that struggling through the hedge reopened old wounds. Could be all sorts of things," she finished lamely. Strudel's eyes were beginning to glint horribly. Gretel decided attack might be the best form of defence. "If I recall," she said slowly, "the unfortunate corpse in Hund's yard was missing a finger. Got to the bottom of that yet, have you, Herr Kapitan?" "I am not at liberty to divulge." "As I thought. No progress made in that regard, then. Pity. Might have shed some light on the curious nature of poor Herr Peterson's demise." She gesticulated at the body. "Aha," said Strudel, a sneer rearranging his features, but offering no improvement to the general rat-like appearance which her fortune had blessed him with. Your remark is a reminder that you are merely an amateur detective and not a kingsman, not employed by our revered monarch and trained in the ways of detection, he said. Your point being? You don't know everything, Fraulein, and you don't know, and you know what they say, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Have you considered taking that phrase up as your motto? You are too quick to jump to conclusions, he told her. This, he pointed dramatically at the corpse, is not Herr Peterson. Of course it is, put in Hans. Met the fellow myself. That's Peterson all right, stake my house on it. He may have called himself Peterson when he met you, said Strudel, but that's not who he really is. Not? Hans echoed. Not? Queried Gretel. Not, declared Strudel, satisfaction at for once knowing something Gretel did not, giving his cheeks a rosy glow. Hans ground his cigar stub under his foot. So who the devil is he then? That is Kingsman's information and not in the public domain. This is not the public domain, Gretel pointed out. This is my garden, and that man, whoever he called himself, is in my garden, ruining my evening. I demand to know who he is. She stood up. Strudel hesitated. Come on, man, said Gretel. Spill the beans. The temptation to show off his knowledge was too great for the Kapitan to resist. His name is Muller, Dieter Muller. He is known to us. In what context? Gretel asked. In the context of being a criminal. Well, obviously, but what sort of criminal? A very successful one, up until now. We've been after Muller for years, but he always covered his tracks, always produced an alibi, always slipped through the net. Yes, well, it wouldn't take a master criminal to do that, would it? Said Gretel. Strudel scowled at her and folded his arms in a that's all you're getting out of me fashion. What I mean was, she said, trying again, when he wasn't doing all that covering and producing and slipping to evade the considerable wit and resources of our wonderful kingsmen, what sort of crimes did he commit? He was a con man, a very good one, pulled off a number of scams in the area. And you couldn't prove he was behind any of them? As I said, he was good at what he did, always one step ahead of us, always knew when it was time to stop, to move on to the next plan. Hans gave a snort. You won't be moving on to anything much now. A thought occurred to Gretel. What about Inga? Who? Inga Peterson, Herr Peterson's wife. The two were besotted with each other. They were on their second honeymoon when we first encountered them. That's right, Hans nodded. All over each other they were. It was quite revolting. It would be. It was Strudel's turn to snort. His wife's been dead at least 5 years. What? Hans gasped. You mean that woman, Inga? She was some sort of ghoul? One of the living dead? A vampire, perhaps? A zombie? Hans, Gretel shut him up. Do calm down. Clearly that wasn't Frau Muller. I know it wasn't. It was Frau Peterson. There is no Frau Peterson, said Strudel. Hans rolled his eyes. Well, not any more. No, not if she's dead. There never was a Frau Peterson, Strudel insisted. Of course there was, said Hans. Met her myself. Told you that. Not very good at remembering facts, are you? Shouldn't you be writing these things down? Gretel could feel the headache coming on, but it was almost worth it to see Strudel's brain beginning to implode. Wife or not, Gretel said, Inga was clearly up to no good with Peterson. I mean Muller. If they were posing as a loving couple and not one, pretending to be Petersons and not that either, they were most certainly not on their second honeymoon. So that leads me to ask, why the cover? What were they up to in Bad am See that required them to do it incognito? Whatever it was must have been for pretty high stakes. She inclined her head towards Peterson Muller. And whatever it was involved more than just the two of them, offered Strudel. We know that Muller was connected to the deceased found in Hunt's yard. Oh, because of the fingers, do you mean? Said Hans. More than that, said Strudel. You see, we know who the dead man was. He paused, entirely for dramatic effect. Gretel had to chomp on her remaining ice cube to prevent herself losing her temper with the Kingsman. His name, Strudel said, drawing the thing out to infuriating lengths, was Muller. Gretel swallowed her ice cube. Hans raised his arms and then let them drop hopelessly against his sides. "Really, Herr Kapitan," he tutted, "I do think you could pay attention. Aren't you supposed to be in charge here? Look, it's quite simple. I'll go slowly. That is Muller, there at your very feet. Looks a lot like a fellow named Peterson, but don't let that confuse you. The body in Hund's yard, well, it's anybody's guess. One thing we know for sure, it's not Inga Peterson, because she's been dead for years, so there's nothing left of her. Of course, it could be Frau Muller, I suppose, but no, that wouldn't work, else how would we have seen her in Bardamsee?" "Herr Kapitan," Gretel spoke gently, "can I offer you something to drink? A small brandy, perhaps? I don't normally drink on duty. I don't think this counts as normal, do you?" "Maybe just a very small one," he said, his voice betraying the fragile state of his nerves. "Ooh, drinkies, is it?" Hans rubbed his hands together and headed for the kitchen. "I'll fetch them. Everyone want ice in theirs?" "No!" Gretel shouted, then quickly recovered herself. "It's good brandy, Hans. Let's not water it down with ice this time." Hans frowned, shrugged, and then went inside. Gretel stepped a little nearer Strudel. "Please forgive my brother, Herr Kapitan. His mind is not as clear as it might be. His experiences as a child, you know." She raised her brows, leaving the implication hanging. Strudel nodded sagely. "Ah, yes, of course. And the facts of the case are confusing after all," he admitted. "Indeed." He shook his head. "It is not enough that we have identified the corpse at the scene of the fire. We still have nothing to indicate what it was, that it was he who started the blaze." "You say he was a Muller too, a brother perhaps?" "Yes, Eric. Every bit as much a scoundrel as his sibling. They would often work together to cheat and defraud people out of their hard-earned incomes. Despicable." "Quite so. But fraud, you say, not violence." "We have never been able to prove a link between the Mullers and any suspicious deaths in the area." "But you have your own theories." "I do." Hans returned with the brandy. Strudel took his and sipped delicately. Hans began trying to recap who was who once more, causing the Kingman to drain his glass in a single gulp. "Hans," said Gretel, "fetch Kapitan Strudel another, please." The alcohol had had an instant and noticeable effect on the little man. Gretel saw her chance. "I am grateful, Herr Kapitan," she said, "that you were available to investigate this terrible event so swiftly." She shook her head sadly, taking in the prone figure still flattening the weeds before her. "Whatever Muller's crimes, it was a horrible death. One wonders what can have driven a person to do such a thing." "The criminal classes fall out with one another just as easily as anyone else," Strudel told her. "Do you think he had argued with his brother, perhaps?" "It is possible, but the pair had worked together for many years without apparent dispute. It's more likely they attempted to double-cross one of their own, and that person exacted their revenge." He hiccuped quietly. "Rest assured, Fraulein, we will not stop until we have got to the bottom of the matter." He looked at her fuzzily, trying to regain his usual aloof and critical composure. "Of course, as Muller was known to you and died in your company with no witness present, I will have to take a formal statement from you." "You surely do not consider me a suspect?" "I would be failing in my duty if I did otherwise." "But, Herr Kapitan, we are on the same side, you and I, the side of justice. I had absolutely no reason to wish Muller any ill. There is the outstanding issue of Beckstein's murder, which was, after all, committed in the hotel in which you and your brother were staying, and with your hunting knife. An unfortunate set of coincidences, I admit, but nothing more." Hans returned with more brandy, but Strudel was starting to remember where he was and what he was supposed to be doing. "I regret to say, Fraulein, that a Kingsman does not believe in coincidence." He signalled to his men to pick up the body and then turned back to Gretel. "You will attend our offices tomorrow to give your account of events. It goes without saying, but you feel you need to say it anyway, that you must not leave Gerstenstadt until our inquiries are completed." "I have business that may demand my attention elsewhere." "Then that business will have to wait. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly." Gretel and Hans watched as the body was removed and the Kingsman trailed out, Strudel all the while barking instructions to remind himself and everyone else of his own importance. That night sleep eluded Gretel. The air was clammy, the temperature was unseasonably high, and her mind was awhir with recent events.